Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. My name is Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. You know, in our hobby, there are a handful of names that everybody knows of, at the very least. Amongst the Baker Street Irregulars, everybody knows Peter Blau. And I dare say, out amongst the general Sherlockian population, Peter's name is pretty well known. Peter is known as a collector, the secretary of the Baker Street Irregulars. He puts out a tremendously informative newsletter and has done that for decades. And I think it's fair to think of him as the corporate living memory of not only the Baker Street Irregulars, but of our Sherlockian hobby in the modern era. It's my great pleasure to welcome Peter Blau to the show. Well, Peter, welcome to the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you today. So, just so people know that our viewers are with us, who are watching today. So, where are you?
I'm in Bethesda, which is a suburb of Washington. We're about 11:30 out from the center of Washington, inside the Beltway, so that even though we're in suburban Maryland, I still claim I'm in Washington.
Well, it is kind of one big kind of metro area, isn't it?
Yeah, the metro area. I arrived in the District of Columbia in 1970, and I loved it. I figured that I would just live and die in the District of Columbia. And then in 2003, I suddenly woke up one morning and I'm in this house in Bethesda. Missed being able to get on the bus and let someone else do the driving to get me downtown. But it's nice out here. Now, let's see, it's after almost 20 years, I can still sort of find my way around the near neighborhood in the suburbs.
Well, I do want
through suburbanity.
That's nice. I also want to compliment you on your pandemic beard. I think that's a good look for you.
Tradition in my family is that anytime we're in the hospital or sick otherwise, when no one is going to care how awful we look, that's the time to grow a beard.
Well, I didn't invite you on the show to talk about your beard, but I think it's a good look for you. But let's just jump in. So, Peter, you are obviously a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. When did you become an irregular?
I attended my first annual dinner in 1958 and received my shilling and my investiture in 1959. I was one of the generation of young punks that Edgar Smith brought into the BSI.
So you have memory of everybody. I mean, that's wonderful to me. So
I never asked Edgar, but I think he decided that the BSI was becoming geriatric. So he just looked for young people to bring them in and see what happened.
How big was the dinner in those days? How many people? I'm sorry?
Everybody came. It was 60 at Kavanaugh's. Nice room upstairs. It wasn't crowded, full of cigar smoke and whiskey fumes, because in those days there was a lot of drinking and smoking. And there was, you went up the stairs, and if you turned left, there was a large room where we had the cocktails beforehand. And then if you turned right, there was the room where we had our annual dinner. And we sat at a U-shaped table with Edgar Smith and a few others up at the head. And you wound up sitting as far away as possible from the head of the table. And as people died, you worked your way slowly up the legs towards the head table. And it was very disappointing, because just about the time when enough people had died, I was getting halfway up it was no longer going to be below the salt. They outgrew the room, and we moved to the players and round tables. That.
Darn. For irregulars like me, who that's such a romantic era in BSI history. I hear about Kavanaugh's, and I hear about these, Edgar Smith, and what was Edgar like as a person?
I never got to spend any time with him outside of the annual dinners, and he was always very busy, or at least keeping an eye on things. So I never had a chance to really have a conversation with him. We corresponded, but I missed having a conversation. I got my shilling in 1959, and unfortunately he died in 1960. So,
Right.
I wish I'd had more time to get to know him. But everybody who knew him said he was just the nicest guy possible.
So Julian was really the head of the BSI when for the first long stretch of.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. So how did you find Sherlock Holmes? When did you discover Sherlock Holmes and kind of fall under this spell?
I unfortunately have no memory of reading my first Sherlock Holmes story. I assume that I read probably The Speckled Band or The Red-Headed League in an anthology in school, because that's in my generation where most people encountered Sherlock Holmes. If it wasn't in a book in school, it was on the radio or television. And they were fun, I'm sure, but I read all sorts of stories, and it didn't really register. What happened with me was that I found the Sherlockians really before I found and bonded with Sherlock Holmes. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and after the Second World War, my father used to go down to New York on business. It was only 150 miles. He'd take me along. And one time in 1945, he said to me, I'm going to meet a book dealer that I've bought books from. I've never had a chance to meet him. It was Ben Abramson. Now, Bennett had a bookshop in Chicago, and my father lived in Cleveland, and he bought books by mail. So during the war, Ben had moved to New York City. We were in Western Massachusetts, and this was my father's chance to actually meet Ben. So we went into the Argus bookshop, and Ben greeted me and said, I want to talk to your father. Go find a book you'll enjoy reading, and let me see what it is. And this is the first time I've ever been in a bookshop. I'd been in bookstores, but never in a real bookshop. I had a wonderful time. I was climbing bookshelves and I finally found a book.
Did you say this was the Argosy bookshop?
Yes, Argus.
Argus, not
the
Argosy.
Argosy is a different story.
Yeah, okay, got it.
And I brought the book up to Ben, and he looked at it, and it was the life poems and stories of Fitzjames O'Brien. And Ben said to me, why do you want to read this? And I said, well, I read two of his stories in school. What was it? And The Diamond Lens, and they were spooky and fun, and I want to read more stories. So Ben said, great. And he said, your father's going to buy you the book. And my father took the book and he opened it and looked at the price, and it was $27.50. Now, in 1945, you could buy a suit and a pair of shoes for $27.
Yeah, that was real money.
So my father said, and Ben said, Alan, it's a first edition. And my father said, well, Peter doesn't need any first editions. And Ben said, Alan, everybody needs first editions. So here's the book. I still have it.
Have it. Oh my gosh, look at this.
And that's what started me off with Ben Abramson. And then every 3 or 4 months, Ben would write me a letter and say, dear Peter, I'm sending you a package of books you will enjoy reading. Tell your father to send me $10. And he was always right. I always enjoyed reading the books, and my father always sent him the $10. And in 1947, he wrote a letter and said, "Dear Peter, I publish a magazine you'll enjoy reading. Tell your father to send me $10. And it was the Baker Street Journal, old series. And here was the BSJ, full of interesting, well-written things by wonderful writers. And I thought it was just fascinating. They were playing this game, pretending that Sherlock Holmes was real. And what was truly wonderful is that I could write to these people and they'd write back. They didn't care that I was a teenager. As long as I was interested in Sherlock Holmes, they'd write back. So I have letters from people like John Dixon Carr and still have them. And
Wow.
So if you're going to read the Baker Street Journal, you better read the Sherlock Holmes stories more than once. And I did. And this was a time when Edgar Smith people were publishing these little pamphlets for $1 or $2. And my father, being a nice father, would just buy everything. And so I got to read all these things. And since he collected books, I collected these things too. Still have them. And it's nice to have been buying all these now terribly expensive limited editions. Just people were desperately trying to get rid of them.
Well, some of that ephemeral stuff is, it's considered ephemeral because it's a pamphlet or it's a, very short booklet or something. But I find that stuff fascinating, and some of it is really quite appreciated in value. I think rightfully so, because it's a window into an era, and in publishing, to publish stuff back then, as you know, it was an effort to do it. And so, guys doing that kind of thing just showed the love of the subject and the hobby and their friends, because that's who they're doing it for. So I think that's wonderful that that you were able to get it and still have it. So about Ben Abrams, he was the first publisher of the journal.
Yes.
And he kind of lost his shirt on that venture. Is that right?
Well, Ben had great enthusiasm. He loved books. I mean, he liked literature. He liked the whole thing. And he liked the idea of the Baker Street Journal. And he thought that everybody in the world ought to read the Baker Street Journal. So he would print far more copies than he could sell. And in those days, you printed them, you made them, and you had them in the basement and desperately waited for people to buy them. But there just weren't a lot of subscribers to the BSJ or to these other things that people were publishing. When the Marquis of Donegal and Edgar Smith created their facsimile of the Baker Street Journal, the first real facsimile of not the Baker Street Journal, of Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1960. This was wonderful. Most of us had never seen a Beaton's Christmas Annual. And they printed 500 copies of it. 10 years after it was published, the Marquis of Donegal was still trying to sell the last remaining copies of the facsimile of Beaton's for the issue price. There just weren't 500 people buying this sort of thing. So Ben had great plans for the Baker Street Journal and couldn't find enough customers and went broke.
Yeah. That's a common thing in Sherlockian publishing, I can tell you. So nobody makes any money on Sherlock Holmes except Conan Doyle. So
sometimes someone will interview you about what it's like being a Sherlockian publisher.
Well, I have stories. But it kind of speaks to the nature of our hobby. You can find Sherlockians everywhere. Everywhere you go, you can run into somebody who loves Sherlock Holmes or who's even kind of a Sherlockian in a sort of the more understood sense. And yet you can't sell 500 copies of something. It's kind of it's kind of a strange thing. It's it's kind of and it's been that way since then and now. So I don't know. It's just kind of interesting to hear you talk about that. But let's talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your favorite memories of the Baker Street Irregulars over the years, of just being a Sherlockian and being an irregular, particularly, in those earlier decades of the 60s and 70s.
Well, my first real story about the BSI is I attended my first annual dinner in 1958 and had a wonderful time and was thrilled to be invited back in 1959. And during the cocktail hour before the dinner, the youngest person there, high school student from Boston Latin High School, came up to me because I was the next youngest person there and said to me wistfully, "How do you get to be a member of the Baker Street Irregulars?" And I told him everything I know. You have to be old. You have to be a scholar. You have to be old. You have to be old. You have to be famous. You have to be old. Well, he shook his head and sadly wandered off. And at that point, Edgar came by and put his arm around me and said, "Peter, I forgot to tell you, you're getting your shilling tonight."
Uh-oh.
Well, in those days, you were expected to say something when you went up to get your shilling. And I have no memory of the rest of the cocktail party. I have no memory of being called on, no memory of hearing my name called. No, I'm told that I said something adequate. My first memory is getting back to my seat with my shilling and looking across the table, and there was this high school student looking at me with anger because obviously I had lied to him. Well, this high school student is still coming to the annual dinner. It's Russ Merritt.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
And Russ, of course, holds a real distinction in the world of Sherlockians today. He's the only living person who has read his first Sherlock Holmes story in a copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual.
He first read Sherlock Holmes in Beaton's Christmas Annual.
Yes.
Well, he's not that old. How did he do that?
Well, it's easy. If your father is interested in books and takes you to the Houghton Library to do some research, and just to keep you occupied while he's doing his research, hands you a copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual and says, "Read this story, you'll enjoy it."
That's great.
So that's how Russ discovered Sherlock.
Well, that's wonderful. Do you have any other? I know that I know there are these moments in BSI history. There's and these sort of names that many people know of but don't know. Can you talk a little bit about Julian, what he was like? I know we just had a book published
Yes.
About Julian, but can you talk a little bit about Julian as the leader of the BSI?
Well, it's hard to think of a story about Julian that wasn't in that book. Well, I can think of one. Julian would have people over for cocktails at his apartment on Riverside Drive on the Saturday. And it was a small apartment, and he was selective. And for some years, I was one of the people that wasn't invited. And I always wished I could go because I knew there were these wonderful people there. And my friend Chris Steinbrenner, who had a bit of seniority on me in the BSI, he was invited. And I would say to him, "Gee, I wish I could be invited someday." And eventually, Julian invited me to the cocktail party in the afternoon. And it was great. As the time passed, more and more people came. It got more and more crowded. Julian finally had to move it to the Grolier Club, which had plenty of room. But as soon as it was the Grolier Club, a lot of people didn't wait to be invited. They just showed up. And since Julian was paying for all of the drinks, it got very expensive. So Tom Sticks Jr. decided he had to do something to rescue Julian. And he made Julian's Saturday cocktail reception at the Goyer Club invitation only. You had to have an invitation, except you could bring a guest, which made it very interesting because there are a number of young Sherlockian ladies who campaigned to get me to bring them as my guest to the cocktail party at the Goyer Club. But I'm trying to think of a story. I'll tell you a story that wasn't in the book. It's not really about Julian. It's about Carl Anderson. Andy was a wonderful collector in Philadelphia. He bought Edgar Smith's collection when Edgar Smith sold it. Andy had a copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual. And the Marquis of Donegal, when they were preparing their facsimile, the Marquis of Donegal asked to borrow Andy's copy so that he could have it photographed for the cover of the facsimile. And Andy sent it to him by airmail to England. And they did the photographic work, and Donegal mailed it back to Andy, airmail. And as Andy told the story, the package arrived, I unwrapped it, and I put it back on the shelf, and 2 days later, my house burned down.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
If only he had sent it back by sea mail rather than airmail.
Oh, that's terrible. That's a whole story.
We're at Julian's party, and Andy was at the party, and Andy, being of the generation that had grown up during Prohibition, liked to drink, and he'd had quite a bit to drink, and Julian said to me, "Would you please see that Andy gets a taxi to go back to wherever he's going?" And I said, "Sure." So I said to Andy, "I'll take you down and get you a taxi." And as we went out of the party, Andy reached out and grabbed a hold of someone else, Norm Nolan, my age. I said, "Come on." So the three of us went down to Riverside Drive, and Norm stayed with Andy, and I went off and found a taxi, came back to pick them up, and we got in the taxi. And Andy gave an address to the taxi driver. He said, "Get in." So we got in, three of us, and we drove to this apartment building, not a hotel, an apartment building. And we went in, and people at the front desk knew Andy and nodded to him and went up in the elevator. He knew the floor, and down the hall. He rang the bell at an apartment, and the door opened, and there was this nice little old lady walking us. "Andy, nice to see you. Who are your friends?" And he introduced us to this nice lady. And we came into her living room, and we sat down on the sofa, the two of us, Norm and me. Andy sitting in an armchair, and this nice lady sitting in a chair. Her name was Inez. And we chatted, and Andy finally said to her, he said, "Inez, show them the book." "Oh," she said. She went off, came back with a book and handed it to me. And I opened the book, and it was a copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual, signed by Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, wow.
I looked at that, and I said, "You're Bill Hall's widow?" And she said, "Oh, yes." And Inez Hall, I mean, she was eventually the woman and a really good friend. And anybody who hands me a copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual signed by Arthur Conan says, "Here, take a look at this." That's going to be a friend for life.
Oh, what a memory that is. That's amazing. Well, let's talk about collecting, because that's a natural segue. Peter, you're known for being a tremendous Sherlockian collector. I know you had a tremendous rivalry with John Bennett Shaw, another legendary. No?
We were never rivals. John and I never competed for anything. In fact, twice we bought collections and just divided them up. Nathan Bengus, when he decided to sell his Sherlockian collection, sold everything that went easily, and he wound up with box after box after box of ephemera junk. But he just couldn't be bothered cataloging and selling and mailing. So John and I went and I collected these boxes, and I knew what John wanted, and John knew what I wanted, so I just divided it up and sent him what he was interested in Sherlockian society material, and I was interested in theatrical material, so we just divided it up. And
that's good. That's great. I mean, because I think the general idea is that these are the two major Sherlockian collectors, and they were sort of, I mean, competing, I think was the word, but that's nice to know that that was not the case.
My first meeting with John Bennett Shaw was in Tulsa, and I was in Tulsa back in my days as a petroleum geologist, and I went to see John at his house, and we corresponded, but this was the first time I met him. Mm-hmm. And we went into his library, this big room, where every bookcase was filled twice, because he not only had a collection of Sherlock Holmes, he had a huge collection of G.K. Chesterton, Isak Dinesen. He had books that he hadn't seen for years. Of course, I went to look at the Sherlockian books. And I did what anybody with any sense does. You look for books that you know about, but you've never seen.
Right.
And I found a little book called Minkera Watson that Henry Lauritsen had done, or his illustrations by dear Watson in Danish. And in there were little vignettes of Sherlockian characters he'd done for the book. Well, I'd seen the vignettes because they've been published in the Baker Street Journal, but I hadn't seen them all. And I said, this is wonderful. It's the first time I've seen this book. And John said, I think there's 2 copies there. And I said, yes. He said, which is the better one? And I said, this one. And he said, put that back on the shelf. You can have the other one.
No.
You'll have it.
That's good. That's good.
Second time, there was a weird and wonderful Sherlockian collector named Doyle Beckmeyer. Young man, accidentally a Sherlockian. He was a member of the Book of the Month Club, and the monthly booklet arrived saying the selection of the month is the complete Sherlock Holmes. And it was too late for him to write back and say, I don't want it. So it arrived. And he figured, well, I didn't want it, but I've got it, so I might as well read it. And that's how he became a Sherlockian. But he had all sorts of things. And he wrote to me and he said, I'm leaving. And I want to get rid of my Sherlock Holmes collection. So I wrote back and I said, well, you can do 2 things. One is you can make a list, catalog, send it to a dealer, and they'll give you some money. I said, or, John and I will buy your collection and we'll take what we want and sell the rest. You'll get more money, but it'll take a while. And Doyle said, no. And he said, the 2 of you can have my collection, but you have to come get it.
Wow.
Well, fortunately, I was going to be at a geology conference in Minneapolis. So after the conference, I flew down to St. Louis and rented a car and drove over to Centralia, which is where Doyle lived. And he lived in the bottom half of a house. Landlady lived upstairs. And this house was full of books. I mean, the living room was full of books. The dining room was full of books. The kitchen cupboards were full of books. You went into the bathrooms, there were books over the bathtubs. And in the medicine cabinet, just books everywhere. He had his books. He had his parents' books. He had his childhood books. He had their childhood books. And I went through and had cartons of all of the Sherlockian stuff, took them down, shipped them off to Washington, came back, thanked him, and left. And the next day, Doyle took his clothes and his toolbox and put them in his car and drove out of town, leaving everything else behind as a surprise for his landlady. And again, John and I just divided all these things up. I mean, we really never competed for everything, for anything. He had at the time the largest Sherlockian collection, and I, on the other hand, had my library was larger than his. So we divided it up. He had the largest collection, and I had the largest library, even though I didn't have as many books. His library was always full.
I've seen those. I never made it to New Mexico, but I remember I've seen photographs of his library, and there's a video out there too of him giving a tour of his, and everything's double, triple shelved, and it's in the garage. It's in the, it's everywhere.
We wound up in Santa Fe, and it's a nice house, and the library was full. And he complained to me, he said, "The library's full. I don't know where to put anything. The garage is full." And I said, "John, it's a Santa Fe. Go out and get some more mud bricks and build another house." He said, we need the yard for the dog. So he never did.
Let's take a break for a moment so we can hear a brief message from our commercial sponsor. All right, we're back. So let's talk about your collection.
Okay.
How big is it?
I don't know. Well, I'll show you. Hang on.
Okay.
All right. If you can see it.
Yes, I can see it.
Let me hold this up a minute. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
There we go.
If you look way in the back, in the chair.
Yes.
So she's been listening to these stories just to make sure I don't tell any bad stories about her. All right, you got me again?
I got you.
Okay.
That was great. So
I think I look better this
So every collector of Sherlock Holmes, or even any collector of any kind, has his or her favorite items. Do you have any items that really stand out to you that you like to show people when they come visit?
Well, Bev is waving because I like to show people Bev. The most interesting, most important things in my collection are the ones that I can tell the best stories about. People that come here and say, "What's the most valuable book you have?" I say, if you want to see a really valuable book, go to the Library of Congress. They've got a Gutenberg Bible. People want to see something that's really expensive. And I don't know what our things are worth and won't know until they're sold, and they're not going to be sold while I'm alive. Every collector has stories about something he bought for $1 or $2 and is worth more than that now. But they're just, I have a copy of The Sign of the Four in Lippincott's monthly magazine. And I remember many years ago opening up a catalog from Peter Stern, and he had one because eventually people discovered this was the first American publication of the story. So it became collectible. And he was offering one in his catalog for $1,500. And I looked at that and I said, okay. And I called John Bennett Shaw. I said, "Have you seen Peter Stern's latest catalog?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "He's asking $1,500 for a copy of Wolcott." John said, "Yeah." I said, "I paid $10 for mine." John said, "I paid $5 for mine." He said, I opened the catalog, I looked over, and he said, and my copy was on the bottom shelf in one of my bookcases. And I realized that we just got a new puppy. So I went over and I put it up on a higher shelf in the bookcase.
This thing's worth $1,000.
Right. So anyway, I got a couple of things.
Yeah.
These are things that I have fun with. Some people collect Baedeker's guides to Switzerland. This is one of the guides, Baedeker's Guide to London, but it's in German. It's London und Umgegend. I don't know if that shows.
Oh, yeah.
It's the 1887 edition. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the copy of the Baedeker's Guide to London that the King of Bohemia brought to London when he came from Bohemia. Because this is the one that was in print when he came. Now, Watson says it was 1888. Baron Gould says it's 1887. Some say 1889. But this is it. This is the copy of Beaton's Christmas Annual that the King of Bohemia would have used when he visited London. And
hey, prove you wrong. I think that's cool. I love that kind of thing.
All right. Good stories. This is a copy of the first American edition of T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. And the reason this is Sherlockian, because in this play, it's in poetry, there's the scene between the tempter and Thomas à Becket. Mm-hmm. And Thomas à Becket says, whose was it? Tempter, his who is gone. Who shall have it? He who will come. What shall be the month, the last from the first? What shall we give for it? Pretense of priestly power. Why should we give it? For the power and the glory. Okay, anybody who's read The Musgrave Ritual knows what T.S. Eliot was referring to when he wrote this in 1935. So I figured that when T.S. Eliot wanted to do something like that for Murder in the Cathedral, he went to a shelf and he took out the John Murray collection of the Sherlock Holmes short stories. And he reviewed this book in 1929. And this is his copy.
Oh.
So.
Oh my gosh. So that's the copy that he pulled down to write Murder in the Cathedral.
Absolutely. So when he murdered the cathedral, he made a long arm and there it was. So you could look at it and see how close he came.
Wow, that's pretty good. That's
another good story is about Alexander Wolcott. And everybody's read about Alexander Wolcott, how he came to the BSI annual dinner and being Wolcott monopolized everything and annoyed the hell out of Christopher Morley, who swore him off and enemies, and that was the end of Alexander Wolcott. But what a lot of people don't know is that Alexander Wolcott was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. This is before they handed out investitures, but the way I know that Wolcott was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars was here is a copy of Edgar Smith's Appointment in Baker Street, been rebound and inscribed by Edgar W. Smith to Alexander Wolcott in appreciation of loyal work as a Baker Street Irregular, Edgar W. Smith, January 3rd, 1939, which is January after publishing. So if Edgar Smith says you're a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, I say, that'll do it.
That counts. Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. That is really interesting. Because the common mythology is that he came, was an obnoxious, boorish, guy who dominated everything and left. he had his day and he had his moment and left. But the more people look into it, the less there's more to that story, and that's really interesting to me. So, yeah, I would say
Well, the nice thing about history is you can be absolutely certain you're never absolutely correct. Because there's always one more letter to discover, one more story to be told. History is never 100%. That's why I collect stories.
Yeah, the stories are, it's what it. I found that too. It's the story that you can tell about a book or an item that will elevate that thing into a completely different category. And often it's a sentimental story or it's an association that will make something give it value beyond its intrinsic worth. And I think that's really interesting.
Association can be important. I, at one time, wound up with 2 sets of the Kroger edition of the works of Arthur Conan Doyle. My first set was a wonderful set, essentially mint in dust jacket. Beautiful set, the Kroger edition. And then I wound up with a second set of the Kroger edition. And there's no sense in having 2 sets. So I had to decide which one to keep. Well, the other one didn't have dust jackets, and the spines were sort of sunned. And someone said to me, well, you could take the dust jackets off the one and move them to the other. And I said, no, you don't do that. That's called made up copy. He said, eventually it'd be obvious that I'd done that. So I wound up selling the set in dust jackets and keeping the other one. And the reason was that this is one of the volumes, The Sign of the Four and The Hound of the Baskervilles. And it has a display label in it. This copy, the set belonged to Dame Jean Conan Doyle. And this book was in the exhibition at Abbey House in 1951. And this is the display label. This is her set, which she very kindly bequeathed to me after she died, and knowing I was a book collector.
Wow, that's quite a pedigree. It was hers, and it was in the exhibition, and it has the display card.
So I also have here, everything leads to something else.
Mm-hmm.
This is the catalog of the exhibition at Abbey House. And that's the first edition. This is the second edition, which has 1 extra page of items that didn't make it into the second edition. This is the large paper, uncut, limited edition of the catalog. There were, I think, 150 copies. This one is inscribed to Nathan Bengus by the librarian and by Jack Thorne, who put the collection together. There are 2 of these that Nathan had. This is one. The other one's owned by Nick Utakin, and that's signed by Adrian Conan Doyle. Nathan, being Nathan, wanted every variant there was. If he discovered that there were 6 different versions of something, he wanted all 6. Dean Dickensheet, San Francisco, used to do his own bone pressings. And he would do little 4-page pamphlets or 8-page pamphlets and give them away. And he did one for the annual dinner of the Baker Street Irregulars and the annual dinner of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and the annual dinner of the Scourers and Molly Maguires. So he just took these and he signed them in red ink for London and blue ink for New York and in green ink for San Francisco. And Nathan Bengus found out about this and wrote a plaintive, because he had the one from New York, wrote a plaintive letter to Dean saying, gee, I really need to have the other variants. I was at Dean's house. He showed me this letter. He said, I just got the extra. He said, so he took a red pen and different, and he signed them and sent them off to Nathan. And he said, my next souvenir, because he knew that Nathan always wanted copy number 4 of limited editions. And he said, my next souvenir, every copy is going to be copy number 4.
That's good.
You asked how many people came to the annual dinner in the old days. Mm-hmm. This is a copy of the catalog for the collection when it was on display at Abbey House. And Morris Rosenblum brought this to the annual dinner in 1960 and collected signatures.
Oh my goodness.
And there's close to 60 signatures in here. And I'm happy to brag. It took me a while, but I deciphered every single one of them so I can identify. This is the sort of souvenir that is fun to have.
Oh yeah. I love an item that that has a pedigree, that you can say this, it's associated with people and personalities and history, and so things like that. So as far as collecting goes, what advice do you have for Sherlockians who are coming into our hobby who want to be who are bitten with, not every Sherlockian is a collector, but those that are, what advice do you give them when it comes to collecting?
Oh, that's easy. The best advice I can give is don't do it. That way, madness lies. Second piece of advice I would give is decide what you want to collect. John Bennett Shaw liked everything. John Bennett Shaw wanted everything. He knew he couldn't afford it, but John said it completist. He said, I collect with all the selectivity of a vacuum cleaner. Whatever it was, John was happy to have it in my collection. Me too. And if you start soon enough and just do this for a long time, you wind up with a lot of stuff. But
it's true.
John and I started at a time when you could get things at reasonable prices. Now, the important pieces of Sherlockiana are either too hard to find or too expensive. So specialize in something. The late Nathan Bengus loved the sign of the 4. He had well over 200 variants of the sign of the 4. Printings and editions and languages. And they are all at the Toronto Reference Library in Toronto. They wisely bought them. Don Redmond used their huge collection of the signs of the 4 for his book, Sherlock Holmes Among the Pirates. And Don went through and did a textual analysis of this so he could trace the plates from one pirate publisher to another, showing just how these variant editions were published.
Wow.
Well, there is a Sherlockian who collects only the Hound of the Baskervilles and only real books. He refuses to go after all these print-on-demand things because anybody could do that. He wants real books. Whatever it is, focus on something. Because if you focus on something that nobody else is focused on, you can find a lot of things. And you'll find people who have things that they don't particularly want. They know you do. They say, here, you'll like having this. And they send it to you. And I still get letters and packages like that. People will say, I found this. I don't need it. Here, it's yours. And the one thing I learned from John, I like to say I learned everything I know about collecting, I learned from John. somebody sends you something, send something back. So John had, and I have, a box of duplicates that we can send back to people who are nice and send things to us.
That's good advice.
So what do you collect?
Well, I collect. I'm well known for collecting things, Sherlockian cinema and television, dramatic interpretations of Sherlock Holmes. I think it's because that was some of the earliest exposure I had to it, and I just, you never know how you can never plan some of this stuff. And you start finding that it's you ever had that experience where you start collecting something and then things just come to you? It's like there's some kind of weird psychic karma starts to happen, and things start to just kind of come your way, and it's very exciting and very gratifying. So there's that. That's one area. I've had an interest for a while, kind of a quiet interest in that first BSI dinner. I'm interested in that. And I've been collecting signed material and early stuff associated with people who were at that dinner.
We're going to turn around briefly. Here's an ashtray from Chris Cella's restaurant.
Oh.
There's a sugar cube.
Oh, look at that. Wow.
Here's a swizzle stick. Chris Cella's, it says, "Please don't break me. Take me home."
Oh, my goodness.
Here are 2 matchbooks and their variants. And I also have somewhere here, but I don't remember where, a dinner plate from Chris Cella. So the next time we have a BSI Saturday reception that people can come to, there's another one. I'm going to auction off a dinner plate from Chris Cella's restaurant.
All right.
So you can sit there and pretend you're having dinner with the original Baker Street Irregulars.
All right. I'm going to have to. Pam will say, "You paid what for a plate? A dinner plate?" It's for charity.
And this stuff is trivial. There are people who collect sugar cubes and, oh, well, they have a duplicate. And they just put them up on eBay. And they've never heard of Sherlock Holmes. So they don't know what Chris Cella's was.
Oh, my goodness. Well, Peter, we are about out of time. I hate that, but we are. I may have you back because I have about half a dozen other things I could talk to you about. But I want to say thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to an opportunity to see you again in person. But Zoom is the next best thing to being there. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for being on the show, and like the beard, it's it's great.
So when are you going to start growing yours?
I don't know. I've thought about it, but we'll see. Maybe one day I'll show up here with a beard.
The real test is what's going to happen when the quarantine ends, and I have to decide whether to shave this off. This is not my first beard. I grew a beard when I was in the Navy in the 50s. And in those days, the Navy, you were allowed to have a beard when you were outside the United States.
Mm.
And my ship went to the Far East, went to Japan. And I grew what I think still is a very nice beard, darker than mine is now. And at the end of our cruise, we were coming back to the United States, and I thought my beard was presentable. And so I went to the skipper, and I said, "Come on, I've got this really nice beard. I'd like to keep it." And he said, "Okay." And I said, I can keep the beard? And he said, yes, in a cigar box.
Is it on a shelf? Do you have it?
Somewhere, some collector has a lock of Arthur Conan Doyle's hair
Think of that.
his widow kept. Lady Doyle had it. It was in the auction in 2004. And so, I don't know, I could save the shavings of my beard and auction them off too.
I think that's an auction item at the next live site. Anyway, thank you, Peter. It's been
All
great.
right.
And yes, thanks a lot. I look forward to seeing you again sooner than later. And that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. That was really fun. I want to thank everybody for watching. I hope everybody's doing well. We have another terrific podcast guest coming up in our next episode. You truly do not want to miss it. And I just want to say thanks again on behalf of the Irregulars, and we'll see you then.
Hi, my name is Bob Katz. I'm a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and I'm the co-publisher of BSI Press, but more importantly, I'm a subscriber to the Baker Street Journal since 1973.
Hello, my name is Ralph Hall of Louisville, Kentucky. I am a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. I have subscribed to this journal I'm holding here before me, the Baker Street Journal, for 40 plus years.
Hi, I'm Monica Schmidt, and you should subscribe to the Baker Street Journal.
Hi, I'm Scott Monty from I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the website and podcast about the connection between Sherlock Holmes and popular culture. You know, the Baker Street Journal has been a wonderful sponsor of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere and Trifles, our companion podcast, for many years. And when you think about the connection between Sherlock Holmes and popular culture, the Baker Street Journal has always been there.
I have literally read every issue of the Baker Street Journal since the old series in 1946.
It's full of Sherlockian scholarship and humor. The artwork on the cover is wonderful.
People take their interest from today and imbue it into the Baker Street Journal in every single issue. And if you're not subscribing, you're missing out on some of the most fascinating and lively scholarship in the Sherlockian world today.
And basically, if you don't read the Baker Street Journal, I don't know why you're being a Sherlockian.
This is where it's at.